Well, it is my pleasure to present Paco Yus. He is also a member of Emofundet. You know, well, I'm sure you all know that he's a world expert in relevance theory. He's a very, knowledgeable scholar, and we was very happy to have him. And so we think that since this is the last plenary of the conference, he's the cherry on the icing of the cake. So last but not least, so we wanted to close with him because we're sure that it's going to be a very entertaining and good talk for all of you. So Paco Yus teaches pragmatics at the University of Alicante, Spain, and he's a member of Emofundet, something, as I said, that we're all very proud of. He has a PhD in linguistics and has specialized in the application of pragmatics, especially relevance theory, to media discourses and conversational issues, about which he has published many articles and books. On relevance theory, for instance, Cooperación y Relevancia, dos aproximaciones pragmáticas a la interpretación in 1997, and the second updated edition in 2003. And he has also made two applications of pragmatics to characters in alternative comics, Conversational Cooperation in Alternative Comics in 1995, or El Discurso Femenino en el Cómic Alternativo Inglés in 2001. He has proposed a pragmatic verbal visual model of communication in media discourses, La interpretación y la imagen de las masas, 1997. Has studied the written oral interface in La preeminencia de la voz, 1998, and developed a pragmatic approach to internet-mediated communication. This is his book, Ciberpragmática, in Arial, or it's Ciberpragmática, the first one, then Ciberpragmática 2.0, sí. And then Cyber Pragmatics by John Benjamins. His latest research has to do with the application of relevance theory to the analysis of misunderstandings and irony, as well as to the production and interpretation of humorous discourses. This is the book Humor and Relevance with John Benjamins, and this is a book you published this year. By the way, I have read 3 chapters of the book already, and it's a very good book. I recommend it to you. He is currently the head of the Inter-University Institute of Applied Modern Languages of the Valencian Community, IULMA, at the University of Alicante, as well as head of the research group Professional and Academic English at the same university. I could, of course, continue giving you a long list of his achievements and publications, but I believe it would be much better for you to judge and enjoy by listening to his talk, which I anticipate to be extremely interesting. So, ladies and gentlemen,
well, thank you very much. Can you hear me correctly? Yeah? Well, thanks for coming. Thanks, Laura, for the idea of this conference and the organization. Thanks, David, also. He's doing a great job in putting all these things together, so all the conferences, all the lectures, all the papers. And thank you all, the audience here, because instead of buying stuff in Black Friday, you're here. I'm sure you are buying stuff with your mobiles. So to be honest, and so I hope to draw your attention to my presentation instead of to the Amazon deals or whatever that you can find. Right. So my talk today. Is to propose an extension and reinterpretation of cognitive pragmatics, relevance theoretic analysis of phatic communication, and apply it to the so-called phatic internet, which I think is necessary in order to understand the full extent of what really is at stake when we deal with the massive amount of phatic exchanges. And parallel. I think that more features have to be added for online phatic, for the explanation of online phatic communication, and we have to spread more stuff, more attributes, more features across the board in order to make sense of the importance of the massive amount of phatic posts that are sent and exchanged on the net nowadays. Okay, so the beginning of this talk is an article that I read some time ago by Vincent Miller. By the way, all the references in this talk are on pages 7 and 8 in the handout. There's a handout somewhere you should be given, or yeah. And in that article, 2008, Miller says that we see a shift from dialogue and communication between actors in a network where the point of the network was to facilitate an exchange of substantive content to a situation where the maintenance of a network itself has become the primary focus. Here, communication has been subordinated to the role of simple maintenance of ever-expanding networks and the notion of a connected presence. So that was striking, coming from relevance theory, which is mainly interested in the interest that content produces in the audience. So having so many trivial, phatic messages on the internet that keeps people so interested in them was a bit of a challenge, and I wanted to provide some sort of explanation from, without moving from the cognitive pragmatics standpoint. So we all have a general idea of phatic communication. We have this definition here. Primarily, I am aimed at establishing and maintaining social bonds between individuals. I would add to social bonds, I would add in things like desire of connectivity, of group membership, or desire to be acknowledged by others, to feel connected to others, etc. That's more important and above the exchange of information, and hence do not necessarily express any particular thought or aim to exchange facts. Okay, so that sounds like the normal idea of having a chit chat and engaging in conversation for the sake of it. Okay, but it's complicated because the functionality of phatic communication reveals a complex cultural, normative, cognitive, and linguistic structure behind it, which speaks to its importance from communicational and sociological perspectives. Okay. So the idea is that this definition of general definition of phatic communication is not satisfactory in a number of ways, and I'm going to hint at some of the things that I will be dealing with in this talk. For example, it's primarily aimed at means that normally the speaker has an intention for bonding, an intention to socialize, an intention for connection. But I guess, and I think that very often you can also have phatic effects generated unintentionally, leaked from normal, everyday, ordinary acts of communication. We will more on this later on. Or, for example, when the definition says social bonds, I will argue later on in this talk that we can also have phatic information leading to the generation of non-phatic implications. Okay, so we can have a typically phatic exchange, and there is no reason why people can draw their own implications, which are not necessarily related to connectivity, social bonding, group membership, or whatever. Things I will also deal with later on the idea that with phatic communication we don't exchange facts, but there's no reason why we can have interesting information provided to other people, and it doesn't mean that we cannot produce phatic effects out of that. So that's some of the things I will be dealing with in this talk. So, and basically the phatic communication is very important because we are dealing with phatic communication on the internet in this talk, and the internet is basically designed for phatic interactions. We have Facebook, we have phatic technologies like Facebook, WhatsApp, Twitter, etc., in which the very design of the technology, the very interface is designed for interactivity, for triviality, for uploading what you're doing, etc., etc. You have those your personal space, self-presentation. Here I am. Okay, I want to talk to you. I want to interact with you. There was no purely interactive area on Facebook for conversation. Okay, we put it in there. We put the messenger there on the right-hand side. No problem at all. We have all the friends, so we're showing how social we are, our friends, etc. And if that's not enough, we also have things like poking a person. Okay, we have things like like liking a person's comment or liking a person's photograph. Now we have a wide variety of reactions, but in the past we could only have good reactions to people's things. Like we couldn't say we disliked what people posted. We have things like a visual, reminder that we've got comments. Oh my God, I got connected. People commented on my stuff. Oh my God, I feel so good. Yeah, I've got, I got friends' suggestions on the round. Yeah, and if you don't access Facebook, that's a problem. Facebook sends you an email to remind you that somebody has commented on something. Okay, so we have phatic communication is already a complicated thing. So, and if we put it on the internet, which is a phatic technology nowadays, like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, then things get even more complicated. Okay. So the idea that my idea here today is that the prototypical pragmatic analysis of phatic communication as it's normally applied to communication is insufficient to account for what is really at stake when we talk about the phatic internet. And I think this we need to add more stuff, more ideas, more features, more elements to understand why this kind of communication has become so pervasive on the net, keeping users glued to the screens. And therefore, we need to add more elements across the board. Okay, now, so actually you have the board there, literally. So we are going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on the left-hand side of the screen some typical assertions or statements or things on phatic communication, and I will add comment on, produce some reinterpretations of these ideas. So the first idea that we have is that phatic communication is intentional. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. So I would say I hinted at that already. I think that phatic communication may also be unintentional. Okay, I mean you may feel phatic elements like connection, sociability, feeling part of the group, feeling connected to others, and still not being the object of an intentional act of communication. On page 1, you've got the traditional relevance theoretic scope of analysis, and the central part, as you can see, has the typical interest. But notice that basically everything is propositional, like explicatures, implicatures, and we also have non-propositional information as long as it is intentionally communicated as an act of ostension. Okay. But I think that's fair. It's fair because I assume that pragmatics, the core object of analysis for pragmatics is intentional communication. But I think there's a lot to say about how unintended effects may be generated from intentional acts of communication that were not initially designed to produce those effects. Now, we will come back to that later on. The second typical statement is that phatic communication is propositional. Okay, and I would say that phatic interpretation may be non-propositional. Okay, the problem with propositions is that propositions have semantic representations, and propositions have to be, you have to be able to entertain them. Okay, and to assess their truth and falsity. And I think very often we don't really go about understanding people propositionally. Okay, so what pragmatics does is they embrace propositional analysis because that's much more easy. Okay, and you've got a quote there by Sperber and Wilson who say that there is a very good reason for anyone concerned with the role of inference in communication to assume that what is communicated is propositional. It is relatively easy to say what propositions are and how inference might operate over propositions. No one has any clear idea how inference might operate over non-propositional objects, say emotions. Propositional contents and attitudes thus seem to provide the only relatively solid ground on which to base a partly or wholly inferential approach to communication. So there is a certain obsession with propositional analysis, which is, I think is fair and it's understandable. And you can see that in all the studies on phatic communication, especially from a relevance theoretic standpoint. You've got Zigarak and Clark saying that an interpretation is phatic to the extent that it contains implicated conclusions which do not depend on the explicit content of the utterance, meaning propositional interpretations that you can actually assess and you can actually consciously be aware of. And you've got Zigarak at the bottom saying that phatic communication is still a case of linguistic communication, because the linguistic properties of the utterance do play a role in the interpretation. But that's okay. I think that's fair. Okay, that's okay. But I think that there's more to it than simply analyzing propositional information. This is the typical idea of relevance theory. Relevance theory says that normally when we interpret a phatic utterance, the explicit interpretation is not relevant. Okay, it provides little or no relevant information. So if somebody says to a friend, "Oh, you have a new haircut," well, that's pretty obvious. I know. She knows she has a new haircut. But there is the interest in that does not lie in the content of the utterance, but in the fact that the person has a communicative intention that validates eventual relevance. The fact of communication, not the fact. The fact of communication generates an array of propositional weak implicatures. So the desire of connection, of sociability, of sustaining conversation, of being acknowledged by others, of group membership, etc. So there is an approach to phatic communication from a purely propositional point of view. And for those who are not, just in case somebody is not aware of the distinction between strong and weak implicatures in relevance theory, the strong implicatures are the ones that we can really say that the speaker had an intention to communicate. I mean, that's pretty obvious that the person had an intention to communicate. Whereas weak implicatures are the ones that people extract or derive by their own responsibility. Okay, and in this example by Billy Clark, in the conversation by Ken and Ben at the top, when Ben says, "I don't have a car," as an answer to, "Are you afraid that the price of petrol might go up again?" We are entitled to derive strongly, strong implicatures like the ones in 1A and 1B. But we may also get implicatures like 2A, 2B, or 2C, which are probably not really meant by Ben when he says that, but they are triggered anyway by Ben's utterance. And obviously there is a point in which we can really say that Ben had no intention whatsoever in communicating them. Okay, so I do acknowledge that sometimes we do entertain mentally the fact that we have a phatic intention with a propositional content. So, for example, if you are in a party, and this guy sees that woman sitting at the table, and he says, "Oh my God, I want to talk to her. What should I say? I don't know." And then you have to come up with something to say to her. So you're aware of your phatic intention, and that the fact that you've got to produce something to break the ice and to start the conversation. Something like "nice party, isn't it?" Which is from the purely propositional point of view is not really useful. But the woman there may also be aware that the guy has a phatic intention, that he has an intention to socialize, that he has an intention to break the ice and start talking to her, maybe chat her up also. I don't know. Eh? But normally what I think is that very often in this kind of conversation, like in this kind of conversation, what we have is feelings and emotions, desires, etc., which are more into the feeling and emotion side of communication, which are attached to the utterances, and people go on with their conversations without really assessing the truthful falsity of the phatic intention, without really interpreting the utterances from a purely phatic way. I think feelings of sociability are attached, or they leak, whatever you want to call it. But I think very often what we do is we attach feelings and emotions, and that's perhaps debatable from the speaker's point of view, but it's really clear from the hearer's point of view, as we will see in a minute. Okay. So basically, the idea that I want to put forward is that on most occasions, the user, talking about internet, obviously, the user processes the phatic text for relevance and may obtain explicit interpretations, which are very often have no interest whatsoever, but they may. We'll see the examples of that there might also be interesting and phatic, or a number of phatic and non-phatic implicatures, usually weak because they are not meant or not overtly meant to be understood as such. And I would add today things like non-propositional effects that may be leaked the main relevance often being in these phatic feelings and emotions rather than in the outcome of the inference of the propositional content. So I will argue that very often what keeps people really addicted to their screens is the phatic feelings and emotions that leak from conversations rather than the actual intentional, overtly phatic stuff that you get on the phones or on the internet. So from the sender point of view, for the idea is that obviously, let's assume that the explicit content of the utterance provides little or no relevant information, but it does not mean that the hearer can get non-phatic weak implicatures triggered by the content, and the hearer often being responsible for the derivation. There is no limit in the I mean, we don't say this is phatic and then we don't pay any attention to the explicit content. We may get extra, let's say, hearer or addressee user centered implicatures, and also some inference of the phatic feelings and emotions associated with the user's attempt to socialize, be connected, etc. So there is no reason why we couldn't be aware of the phaticness of some users' post and at the same time interpret the utterance and get some implications out of it. Okay, and from the just to show an example, imagine that on Twitter somebody says, making a yummy sandwich and looking forward to tonight's film on TV, okay? Which looks like a typical phatic thing to say. Initially, the hearer or the addressee user may be entitled not to value that too much and think about sociability and stuff. But there is no reason why the addressee user might not get things like the weak implicature you have there. Like Tom has recovered from the recent painful breakup with his girlfriend because he looks contented with himself, because he looks happy, okay? So why not get some, implications like this one, which are the addressee's responsibility? And also, why not? Okay, I'm not denying that posts like this may get some inference of some phatic intentions, like desire for connection, of sustaining chat, of being acknowledged, of being connected, of being, but I think that's the feelings that the user has, rather than the actual explicit intention to be phatic. Actually, I had a survey with 100 students a couple of years ago, and I asked them with posts like this what they meant, and nobody meant to be sociable, to socialize, to get answers. Nobody would acknowledge that. They would say, no, I'm just informing what I'm doing. I'm just telling them what I'm doing. They don't see the point of acknowledging and admitting that they had a purely interactional, social, phatic intention. They say, no, I was just posting my stuff. They don't think it twice. If they don't think it twice, it's because they don't entertain propositional the intention to be phatic. So therefore, that must be leaked somehow in a kind of non-propositional way. Okay. And again, from the addressee user's point of view, we have the same. With the addressee user gets some feelings and emotions associated with the posting of the message, plus perhaps some weak implicatures, and also the hearer may also get some phatic effects leaking from the act of communication. I will argue what you have at the bottom of the left-hand side, that it's crucial nowadays. The non-propositional effects that the addressee user gets from the ordinary acts of communication, feelings of connection, of sociability, of sustained conversation, of being acknowledged by others, group membership, etc. There is this morning Javier was showing you an advertisement of Repsol, and there is another one which is interesting. We have this girl who's really, really angry because she's going to spend the summer in the village that she hasn't been to for many years, and she thinks she's going to be really bored there. And so she's in the car and she looks really unhappy. And to make matters worse, there is no connection with my mobile, so that's even worse. And then she suddenly finds connection because she's close to the petrol station. That's part of the advertisement. And then she sees all these messages. When are you arriving? We're waiting for you. There is a schedule to do something in Anna's house. Are you joining us? And then she realizes that she feels part of the group, acknowledged, etc. And everything is happy afterwards. She loves her mother. She loves her because now she's part of the group. She feels connected. She feels acknowledged. She feels valued, etc. But I don't think, if we asked the girl, I don't think she would say, "Okay, I'm entertaining." I mean, I really feel that. I really know they are. I feel connected. She feels good. She feels good about receiving the messages, and there's got to be a cut point beyond which we cannot say that this is a propositional interpretation. Okay. Right. So the idea is that to explain that, I have added in previous papers and previous lectures the two columns that you have on both sides of the first page of the handout. I have added contextual constraints and non-propositional effects, which on page 2 they are developed. I mean, I'm not going to go into that because I have talked about that in previous papers. Okay, so the idea is that, and it's going to be useful to explain why we are so obsessed with being in front of our mobile phones or computers. The term contextual constraint is restricted to aspects that underlie or frame communication and interaction. They exist prior to the interpretive activity and constrain the eventual successful or unsuccessful outcome. Okay, so they are obviously they are not part of communication because they underlie communication, but they play a part, especially in internet communication. I'm not going to go into the whole page, but notice that there are user-to-system constraints in the sense that familiarity with the interface may play a part in how satisfied you are with communication, or if you find it hard to browse the menus or find the information you're looking for, you're going to find it hard to feel close or willing to use the interface. And there is also and that's the one that we want for phatic communication, the user-to-user constraints. Okay, and also these constraints are important in a number of ways because they have an impact on how much discourse is produced. The capabilities of the interface, on what kind of discourse is produced, what kind of reaction is expected. In terms of sender users' expectations, what kind of discourse is possible in terms of interface affordances, and what kind of discourse is expected in terms of audience validation of your post, whether people react accordingly. And the other term that you have on the right-hand side of the chart is the term non-intended, non-propositional effect, which refers to feelings, emotions, impressions, which are not overtly intended but are generated or leaked from the act of communication and add positively or negatively to the relevance of the interpretation of the online discourse. And you've got that on the right-hand side. And again, they are user-to-system and they are user-to-user effects. And they are also interesting because they have an impact on the positive or negative outcome of one's acts of communication online, of course. On the preference for a specific site, for a specific medium, specific channel, for why certain interactions are profitable or unprofitable despite the lack of or despite the existence of interesting information, or an impact on one's awareness of personal and social roles through interactions, or on what kind of residue is leaked from everyday acts of communication, and how they make us feel. Okay. So that addition, I think, is useful to explain today's tendency towards a more phatic quality of internet communication, in which we have very trivial stuff being said, like humor-filled utterances, like memes, mocking, teasing, ironical remarks, etc. That is often, from a purely informational point of view, it may be irrelevant, and is constrained in a number of ways because some desires of the user to be connected, acknowledged, to be regarded as part of the group, etc. And some interface-related constraints in terms of, because we have phatic technologies, we have Facebook, which is designed for phatic communication, etc. And then we have non-intended, non-propositional effects that may leak in the addressee user as part of, beyond the actual act of communication. And I think that's the main source of relevance on many occasions. Okay, not the propositional interpretation, but the effects that leak out of them. Okay, so the idea is this one, and we also talked about that phatic utterances may be non-phatic. I would say the opposite, that non-phatic utterances may be phatic. We have things like nice weather we're having, and hi, how are you, which are typical instances of phatic communication. But if we change the context, for example, in the first case, if Thomas has said to John that that morning that it was okay to go to the beach, and then John says, nice weather we're having, that would be an ironical intention, not a phatic one. If in the case of the second, if Anne and Rose share the information that Rose is recovering from a serious illness, how are you would be a request for information. And then we have the typical idea that phatic communication is speaker-centered. Okay, so if we continue with this idea of non-intended, non-propositional effects, I think that most of the obsession with internet communication does not lie in the speaker's attempt or overt attempt to be phatic, but in the hearer's feelings and emotions associated with ordinary acts of communication. Okay, so we have the sender user, which he may hold or she may hold a phatic intention or phatic feelings, and resort to a prototypical phatic utterance that triggers reactions from peers, acknowledgement, willingness for interaction. That's assumed. I'm not saying that is not the case. But also the addressee user may find or obtain phatic feelings and emotions beyond the sender user's intention and beyond the propositional quality of the interpretation. And that I call that phatic effects. I think that I have mentioned that already in previous slides. Okay, I differentiate between phatic implicatures, which would be the typical analysis that we have in phatic communication, and phatic effects, which are the ones that I really think they are very interesting because they are crucial for explaining that. Now, in this age that we are living in, which we don't connect to the internet, in which rather we move seamlessly between virtual and physical interactions, and in which, as I claim in my latest book, I think the user nowadays is a node of intersecting interactions of a virtual and a physical kind. I think we should say, or it should be possible that phatic communication works both ways, in virtual and physical interactions without much differentiation. But the reality is that very often what we have is a virtualization of physical interactions. Okay, we are still there, but we don't pay attention to the other person, to the person who are in front of us. Okay, and I think by using the new terminology, that's pretty easy to understand. Why does a person, the interlocutor here, the poor woman asking, "Do you mind if I strap your phone to my forehead so I can pretend you're looking at me when I talk?" Why is this poor woman losing the battle? Because she can't win against the net. Okay, the idea is that she can't compete against the net because the internet interactions are contain too many positive contextual constraints, and internet interactions provide or generate too many positive non-propositional effects associated with virtual interaction, which cannot compete with a single one-to-one physical interaction that we have in a normal scenario. Now, interestingly, positive contextual constraints influence the user's activity, especially when sending messages. So we have things like immediacy of communication, constant connection. We have things like lack of imposition on addressee's reply. We have things like non-compulsory commitment to the conversation. Okay, we don't have to, make an effort because the other person is speaking. I have to answer. Oh my God, you can plan and design the messages, which you cannot do when you are face to face with a person, and you can control how much information is provided, especially this exuded nonverbal stuff that you can control. And of course, you can be more playful if you use text and image and emoji and everything. So the idea is that even though we do have contextualized ways of communication, we still prefer to use the typical typed text because that is positively constrained. Imagine, for example, Messenger's phone calls. Okay, Laura, I'm calling you. Okay, now WhatsApp now allows for free phone calls because you can, if you have Wi-Fi connection, the phone calls are free. And now I think in the latest update, you can also have video calls. So for cyber pragmatics and pragmatics in general, it's really hard to understand why people do not use the phone call through the mobile phone, because that's more contextualized, richer. You get the person's voice. Is less prone to misunderstanding. But the idea is that the previous positive constraints are, far too satisfactory, far too good for people to engage in this tiring kind of communication. And there is some humorous meme on the internet that says, it's in Spanish, but I'm translating it. First SMS, then came WhatsApp. Now you record an audio file and your friend records a reply. If they continue like this, they will end up inventing the telephone. Okay? So the idea is that, the joke is, come on, you've got the telephone, use it, no? And so why on earth are you sending audio files instead of phoning the person? And the reason is this one, that you've got so many positive constraints associated. You don't want to interfere, you don't want to impose, you need time to plan your message. You want to have control of the situation. And the same happens with non-propositional effects that are generated when receiving messages, okay? And that's beyond, I'm insisting that these are generated beyond the propositional content of the utterance. And these are things like feeling connected, very typically phatic, being acknowledged, connected presence, that, we have lots of synchronous conversations despite the physical distance. We have feelings of group membership, WhatsApp groups, for example, being part of the community, socialization, etc. So that's the reason why we are glued to the screen. So we are desperate for virtual positive non-propositional effects of a phatic kind. We are addicted. We are gagging for them. Okay, so we post a video on YouTube. Oh my God, is anybody commenting on it? Or I post something on the about fobbing, which is actually something to do with the lecture now, the mala costumbre, the bad habit of looking at your mobile while in a physical scenario. And my God, nobody commented on that. I'm really depressed. Or I put my niece put a nice photo of her, and she got all qué guapa eres, guapísima. Oh my God, yeah, I got commented. I feel so good. Or if you're in a WhatsApp group, well, are there any new messages? Okay, or any new likes? I got no likes from my post. My God. Is that good? Well, that's what happens. Obviously, there are some critical opinions, and I am giving you this one, which is by an expert on internet communication, by Serie, who in her latest book, Reclaiming Conversation, says, what's wrong with face-to-face conversation? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't control what you're going to say. In-person conversation leads to the most emotional connection, and the students, obviously in her research, try to warm up their digital messages with emoticons, typing the sounds of laughter, etc. But these techniques do not do the job. It is when we see each other's faces and hear each other's voices that we become most human to each other. And she insists in her book a lot that takes effort, and that's not for free. It's not like these non-propositional effects that flood your ego, okay, or the facility of typing messages that really makes it so easy. Okay? So you've got on pages 3 and 4, just for you to look at, you've got some quotes from authors dealing with what I call non-propositional phatic effects on the internet. Some quotes by people, and again, you've got the references on pages 7 and 8 of the handout. Okay, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Okay. Okay. So also, phatic communication is tied to utterance interpretation. That's a typical idea. I would say that phatic communication may also be tied not to the interpretation of the utterance, but to the act of communication as a whole. Because sometimes we don't get reward or relevance in terms of relevance theory. We don't get relevance from the content, but we do get relevance from the act of communication as a whole, and that obviously connects with my idea of producing effects which are not tied to the utterance. Okay, so that light blue thing in the middle of the slide is the typical relevance theoretic analysis of propositions in terms of explicatures, implicatures, higher level explicatures, feelings and emotions when intended, etc. But I would add that very often the eventual relevance of the phatic act of communication lies in the leakage of information that comes from the act of communication as a whole, not from the interpretation of the act, but from the act as a whole. And then finally we have the idea that phatic communication content is irrelevant. Okay, that the explicit interpretation of the utterance is of little or no relevance. I would add that sometimes you can have phatic communication with content which is relevant in its own sake. Okay, so we have things like trivial phatic posts that may be relevant. Okay, I assume that many of the posts, many of the messages that we send on the net are really trivial, but very often they may be relevant eventually. An example is Twitter. You can have ordinary trivial comments by a person which are obviously non-relevant in their own sake, but the chained interpretation of these messages may generate relevant outcomes. For example, if you have a sequential understanding of some users' ordinary comment, we can have a sort of ambient awareness, as Thompson used to call it, an ambient awareness of what the user is engaged in, a kind of presence in the distance that dilutes the feeling of separation between the user and the friends or followers. And also from a pragmatic point of view, we can say that these trivial comments generate a cumulative background information on the user from the information that is provided in these trivial messages. This background of triviality is important because it forms a sort of preliminary context upon which subsequent interactions may be constructed. Okay, because we have this mutuality of information thanks to this trivial information that was posted. And the other way around, we may have relevant posts that turn out to be phatic or are key to the generation of phatic effects. For example, these are my latest 2 posts on Facebook. The first one is information about Alicante, or how Alicante has been named one of the 10 best places of the world to live in. And also this video of footage showing the incredible bumper-to-bumper traffic in Los Angeles as Americans travel for Thanksgiving, which I think they're okay. I think they're good. They're substantial, interesting stuff. Yeah, that I wanted to share with my friends. No phatic intention here. I don't. Well, maybe I could admit that there is a bit of But later on, if you get some interactions like the one you have on the left-hand side, I may have some feelings of connectivity. My posts were acknowledged. People commented on that. I will feel good about that. I will get non-intended, non-propositional effects of a phatic quality because I feel good, but I didn't mean it. Okay, I didn't mean to do that because I wanted to get my reward. I wanted to share that information with my peers. Yeah. Well, that's pretty obvious. Yeah, that's pretty obvious. Yeah, but it's not representable. It's not like, okay, I assume, I entertain that. You see what I mean? Okay. So the idea today is that we can open up new possibilities across the board. Okay. The prototypical instance, the super phatic thing would be to produce content that yields little of substantial relevance at the explicit level, but triggers a number of phatic weak implicatures that are also possible, and a number of non-propositional phatic effects that may leak also from the act of communication. But the new possibilities open up. Not only the user's intention is typically phatic, but it may be non-phatic and still get phatic effects. The explicit discourse is typically not relevant or not producing substantial or substantive information, but it may also be quite relevant and produce the leakage of phatic non-propositional effects. The implicatures, the weak implicatures are typically phatic. Okay, there's no reason why people can get non-phatic implicatures and still assume that the person has feelings, desires of sociability. Or the non-propositional effects I'm talking about, they are the ones that I'm interested in, the phatic ones that you get out of proposition. But obviously it may be non-phatic as well, okay? So what you have on pages 5 and 6 is a whole taxonomy, a whole combination of these parameters, okay? I'm not going to review them all, but the idea is that at the top, in which you have phatic, you have the highest level of phaticness in internet communication, and as you go down in the chart till the very end on page 6, you've got the 0 level of phaticness in internet communication, and there is a whole range of possibilities in people who wanted to be phatic and didn't turn out to be understood as that, people who were thought that they were interesting and then got some leakage of phatic effects. We get all sorts of possibilities that I think have to be spread across the board in order to get a more accurate understanding of why phatic communication is so pervasive, so important, so intense, so abundant on the internet, and why we dismiss face-to-face communication and prefer to be glued to our screens. Okay, so thank you very much. I think it was more or less in time, wasn't it? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paco. Very interesting indeed. And yes, I was also thinking about the playful thing. You know, that's sometimes you do it just to play, with your friends there, and that's
mocking.
Motivations.
I think Carmen, who's there, has done some stuff on mocking on the Carmen Maiz, mocking stuff on the internet. Yeah.
So, any questions, Carmen?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Paco, for a very inspiring talk and brilliant as usual, but you know that. And I just have a question. I mean, it's really interesting what you mentioned about phatic effects, but how can we really measure that? I mean,
well, it's really difficult to measure that.
Yeah, but
because sometimes sometimes the addressee user feels good, but is not aware that he's feeling good. And if you ask him or her, why are you that happy in front of your screen? And very often they will say, I feel good, or makes me feel good, but they are not really able to pin down their feelings much further. But I think they do exist. I mean, even from
sure.
I think that what keeps people, especially adolescents, they need this constant acknowledgement of their phatic situation, like being social, being acknowledged, and people care for me, etc. And they feel good, and that's leaked, I think, rather than entertained as a proposition.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
I can also be just loud.
Well, you have strong voice, yeah.
Okay then. Thank you for I think very interesting was the part where you showed why people would choose text messages over calling. And there I just had one thought that certainly for me is the case. When I call somebody, I force him or her to be present at the moment. I tear him or his out of the presence, and we go somewhere else. And with texting, I can choose myself when I take my mobile phone out of my pocket, so I can just live on what I'm doing, and when I have my time, then I take it out, and then I do it. And otherwise, if somebody calls me, then I don't. I also just let it ring, because if I'm somewhere and doing something that's good for me, then I don't let. I want to enjoy my presence.
Yeah, there is a level of imposition with phone calls that does not exist on with posts, with messages.
Have you considered this interpretation too, maybe, or what do you think about this? Maybe?
Well, I think it's a matter of not putting too much of yourself into the business. You don't feel pressed into having to improvise your talk without having. I mean, we are really used to planning our messages, even if it is rather quick. We still want to add that emoji, and that we want to make a colorful, and we feel that we are going to not to do a good job if we have to answer and improvise, as it happens in face-to-face communication. And also, obviously, what you talk about, the part in which I try to explain why people are so obsessed with having a look at the mobile. I think it's the idea is that you get so much reward in terms of phatic effects from your peers that you don't get it from one single person in front of you. That's a losing battle. It's a losing battle, yeah. I'm not saying it's good. I'm probably Serie Turkle is right in saying that it takes effort. Come on, empathy is face to face, no? Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, Ian.
Very interesting talk. Thank you very much. So I guess this relates to the interjection, my rude interjection in the middle of your talk. I've heard it suggested that many of our actions are not intentional. That the choices we make as we go through life.
You don't mean in communication? Do you mean on an ordinary basis?
In general, yes.
Yeah.
But taking that kind of observation or idea into this context, it strikes me that a lot of communication, you may not have an intent, cognitively, you may not be aware that you're intending a phatic element in the communication. So in the example of the post that you put up on, it was a Facebook, I suppose, that you put a face up on this comment up just for communication, but on some level, your mind is perhaps aware of the positive feedback that you are likely to receive.
Yeah, that's probably, yeah.
So there's this kind of.
So you wouldn't admit that you had this intention, but it's
right,
somehow there, and in the background. I hope I get comments. I hope I get some interaction out of it. Yeah. I'm sure this is an interesting bit. I didn't want any phatic stuff with it, but I'm so happy that I get some replies. Yeah.
So I wonder if there is actually, if you can look at a distinction between where there really isn't any intention, phatic intention, and where there is. Maybe that distinction is stronger and more relevant here than the distinction between unintended phatic intention.
You mean there is a continuum of cases? Yeah, there is a continuum of cases.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, but the problem is that if you ask people about their intentions, they will often not admit that they had a phatic intention.
No, but
they will also say, no, it was it was a piece of information. Yeah, no. Yeah.
It makes it hard to measure, but maybe there's ways that we can do it trickily.
So interviews are not worthy. They're useless. Yeah, they won't admit that. They did that for the sake of getting connections, acknowledgement, feelings of group membership.
But you can get people to admit things, like psychologists do this all the time with their queries, and their Likert scale psychometric questionnaires and the like. That you can cleverly imply that there was some sort of a phatic effect through analysis of their responses. I don't know. Just kind of opening up this kind of area.
Yeah, but things are already rather complicated as it stands.
Yes,
but you can become even more complicated. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much. I'd like to come and talk to you about this later.
Yeah.
So would you say, Paco, that then this communication on the internet, cyber communication fosters our narcissism because we want to be liked?
Well, there's a point. Yeah, there's obviously narcissist personalities. There is an analysis I'm doing on identity on the internet based on this classification, and of course there are one of the user-to-user constraints is whether the person is a narcissist or the person is shy. That has an impact on the production of stuff on the internet. But of course there is a tendency to be sort of addicted to this acknowledgement from their peers that that I'm there, that I'm part of the group, and I guess that is one of the reasons why we feel that we don't get enough from face-to-face.
Yeah, so that's
one-to-one communication.
They have this hidden intention, which is more than phatic.
And I think I'm not saying this is good. I'm not saying this is good. I'm trying
not
to
judging. We're just analyzing.
I'm showing what it is. Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Well, all right. So thank you very
Thank you.
much, Paco. It's been a pleasure.